for it to pop up for everyone. Alrighty. Well, welcome to our final adoption session of the day. This is Coffee Talks with End Users with Dominique, Dennihy-Bailey. Excited to pass this over to her really quickly. I do have some housekeeping that I want to run through really quick. This meeting is being recorded. We're actually going to upload all of these sessions out to our YouTube channel. So if you missed one or if you want to go back and rewatch some of the content, you'll be able to access it out in YouTube. We are asking that everyone puts themselves on mute throughout the session, though if you have any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand, add those comments into the chat. Michelle Gilbert and I are here to help kind of watch the chat and help bring you into the conversations throughout the presentation. Dominique can always pull you in too. If you need live captions, I have them turned on so you can actually turn those on from your side too, which is always great. At the end of the session, we'll be giving away a $25 gift card. We always encourage a lot of participation throughout the session, so that may help influence your opportunity for that gift card. And then finally, we're doing a grand prize drawing at the end of the day. So right after this session, where the grand prize is actually a Surface Laptop Go. So really excited about that. So if you haven't already clicked on this link, this is presented in PowerPoint Live, so you can go ahead and you can click on that URL right from the slide to open it up in your browser. You'll want to go through and fill out all of the information about the presentations that you've sat into today. It'll be really helpful for us moving forward. Lastly, I do want to provide a quick little shout out or a thank you to all of our sponsors that have helped make this event possible. Here's all of the sponsors that help contribute to today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dominique.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pete. I'm going to switch this slide deck over and present in team. So let me know when you see that deck come through. Clicking on present right now. Awesome. And thanks for the intro, Pete. I appreciate it. It's so great to work with you guys. I am so happy to be here today, everyone. Pete, you can hear me okay? We'll do a quick little tech check. You can hear me? You can see me? All right,
Sounds
awesome.
Perfect.
Slides look okay? I tried my best.
No, look perfect.
As long as you could see them. That's the important part. Everybody, thank you so much for sticking around for this session. I am so excited to talk to you today about what I call discovery sessions. This is going to be a session focused on change management. It's more of like a strategy session, and what I hope to be pretty interactive and discussion based and hopefully pretty engaging. This is not going to be a technical session in any shape or form. And as you go through my methodology, you might get to pick up on why I'm kind of taking that position. So yep, quick summary. Discovery sessions are a fundamental part of our change plan. And we're going to talk about how we can learn a little bit more about our end users and some of the problems that happen when we make those assumptions about how end users work and why they, work the way they do. So let me introduce myself. My name is Dominique Dennihy-Bailey, and I'm a customer success manager at Microsoft. As a customer success manager, I'm focused on end user experience. I'm focused on change management, end user journey mapping, skilling. So I really am the least technical person on my team because I'm really focused on employee experience and what I always say is like the people side of change, right? And I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. So as I'm switching over slides, I'm going to kick a question out to the audience, and I'd love to see responses in the chat. Do we have any change practitioners out there? Is anybody on our call right now focused on change management around IT or focused on building what they say as an employee experience? I'll just take a second to see some thumbs up. I see a lot of thumbs up. I like that. This is going to be very engaging. That's great. I'm so glad to hear it. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you. Like I said, I want this session to be engaging, hopefully a little interactive and discussion based. So I encourage you to use that chat. I encourage you to come off mute or raise your hands. And we are going to talk a little bit about your experience, share your insights, and maybe even brainstorm together some strategies that work well for you and some lessons learned, because I think that's a great way to share those pro tips and really all collaborate together. So what are we doing today? Your time is valuable. I'm going to tell you what I have plans, and hopefully you stick around after that. So for the agenda, we're going to go a little bit over the methodology and kind of like how I approach discovery sessions and why. We're going to talk about some outcomes, like what's the point of doing this, right? You're going to invest this time with your end users. Why? What are we getting out of it? We're going to talk about some of the findings that come from discovery. We're going to talk about how to ask good questions, some tools that you could use, the discovery session format, and then I'll walk you through what I like to call coffee talks. So just a fun little exercise at the end. Hopefully we have enough time. Along the way, I'd love for you to understand like the purpose of a discovery session, the effective strategies that you could use. We'll do a little bit of coaching today and like a little bit of training on it, but I really want you to kind of get this concept as like another tool in your toolkit, right? Another way to approach end users, approach change management, and kind of really dig in at a granular level, but at a level where I believe you could scale, right? And that's going to be the difference that we call out when we think about persona mapping versus discovery sessions. At least the difference in my mind. All right, awesome. So with that, I'm going to kick off. Any questions before we get started, or anything kind of like on the top of mind around discovery that you might want to know? And I can make sure to talk about that. All right, so I'm going to kick off with a question before we dig in. I want to know, has anybody ever done persona mapping or discovery sessions? Beth has. All right, Beth, that beat me to it. I'm going to put a question in the chat. Have you ever done discovery with end users or persona mapping? And like I said, to me, they're slightly different, but it's in the same vein of that learning, right? That learn it all mindset, that way of getting into your end users' workflows and understanding what makes them tick or what makes them not tick. You know, they want to, we want to make sure we solve those challenges for them. Okay, I see some thumbs up. I love it. That's how I keep track of what is going on and who is on our call. So I see we got about 3 thumbs up. So we've got some people that have done this before. Okay. Awesome. That means that for everybody else, it might be new. I like that. This is a good opportunity to just kind of see how other people work, or just kind of like what works, you know, for I guess my world. All right. So I'm going to do the boring academic part. I just want to give you a quick overview of the framework I use, just because I'm going to reference it quite a bit. And I want to make sure we're kind of on that level playing field in terms of like definitions, or like how the methodology that might seem very familiar. Awesome. I see some really good questions coming through. Good ways to share persona maps. Yep. We're going to talk about that. So a lot of my methodology and my approach is informed by ProSci. Give me a thumbs up if you know ProSci. Okay, here we go. We got those thumbs up. I love it. Okay, so we know ProSci. At Microsoft, we are trained in ProSci, so you'll probably hear us, especially the CSMs or people talking change management. You'll see us reference that. You'll see us put little badges in our emails. So we're all trained from this particular framework, and it's a framework for managing the people side of change. So, and that's a phrase you'll probably hear me say quite a bit today, that people side, and that's because there's multiple. Well, there's 2 sides of the projects. You know, you have the technical side and the people side. And the technical side is focused on the design and development and delivery. And that's fabulous. That's the stuff that really stands up to change, that goes into the Azure AD and the network security and the architecture and the design. And that is wonderful. And we need that to work. Then comes the adoption change management layer. And that's the people side. This is focused, in my mind, on stories and scenarios and use cases and employee experience, right? And it's these 2 pieces that work together to make a project very successful. Oops, let me go back one. But that's kind of like the mindset of what ProSci is, and like the change management framework that comes from ProSci. And I'm going to focus, like I said, on the people side, and I am going to focus on the embrace, adopt, and use components. The other piece of my methodology that you're going to hear me reference is this ADCAR. It's an acronym. I know there's tons of business acronyms out there, you guys. I like this one because it helps me break down the different steps. And I'll just go through this at a very high level. There's no quiz at the end. But it talks about this idea of awareness of change, making your end users know that change is coming, right? We've all heard that book, like, who moved my cheese? And we've all been in those scenarios where you log on and something's completely different. And it's very upsetting, even for someone in IT. So imagine how your end users feel. We're going to talk a little bit about the desire to participate and support in the change. Like, how do you get people excited? How do you get people to raise their hand to be a champion, to work with you when they don't have to? That's not their role. So we're going to talk a lot about that, right? And that's going to be that some of the work that we're going to talk about today is done in that discovery session. Knowledge is going to talk about how to change, right? How do you do the change actually? Ability is the ability to implement those desired skills. And then reinforcement, making sure that you're reaching out to your end users. Are you happy? Is it working? Do you need support? So that's kind of like the basic methodology. Like I said, this could be a whole session by itself. I just want to give you the backbone of the framework that I use to help kind of ground some of those terms. Awesome. So I want to specifically focus on that desire piece, the desire for change, right? Because that's the hardest part. You could tell them that the change is coming. You could teach people how to do the change. You could educate them on how to go through new workflows. But how do you get that want? How do you get them to want to change, right? And we get that in all aspects of life, whether that's like someone getting someone to clean their room, or maybe like in my case, my toddler, getting him to want to eat dinner. It's hard. It's hard stuff. But in this case, we do have some tools and we do have some methods that you could use to dig into that desire, right? To tap into that with your end users. And for me, that's that tool of end user discovery. Okay. So end user discovery, I put some bullets here. I just want to talk through at a very high level about how I define end user discovery. And for me, it's really about these kind of casual conversations. It's more about like kind of like an interview style approach, and the conversations are not technical. Okay, if you're tuning into anything today, we're not talking technical. We're not talking any type of license. We're not talking any type of network. Remember, if you think about that project architecture, that's a technical side. There's other teams taking care of it. We're going to focus on the people side. So when you look at the way that I kind of broke out, what is end user discovery? What isn't it? You could see I was talking about it's listening. It's an informal conversation. It allows us to uncover workflows, to map processes, discuss challenges, and learn about what works well. And that last one's really important. I think sometimes that gets overlooked because when we try to learn about workflows, we love to find out what doesn't work. So we're going to fix it. But it's also important to find out what works well, because then you could amplify it. And sometimes focusing on the positive reminds end users that they're doing a great job, right? That technology works and it works for them. And by learning more technology, you can do things better, right? You could do things differently. The other piece of end user discovery that I want to point out is what it is not. Okay, and this is also important. Directionless gripe sessions. That is my number one. How many of you have done persona mapping or these type of interviews that kind of dissolve into these grouchy ladybugs? I see a lot of thumbs up. Yep, I've been there too. And then they kind of go out of hand, and you're sitting there and you're wondering like, okay, how do I get it back on track? Hey, John, I see you've got your hand up. Do you have something to chime in about that? You can come off mute if you
I was
would
going
like
to say
to.
I've gone through I don't know how many migrations.
Oh, John, I think you're back on mute. I wanted to hear what you have to say. Oh,
Okay, maybe there we go. No, I've gone through
talk to me.
several with a bunch of different industries,
Hmm.
and it's always a struggle I've seen with some people that are so set in their ways. But then you have in the same group, you have people that are excited that really want to learn new things and learn a new tool.
Yeah.
And I've literally had fights break out in sessions like this.
Oh my goodness.
Not
Like
fun.
what do you do, John? Like when you have these sessions and you're kind of going through this listening process, how do you act like a referee? How do you get it back on track?
Um, try to remind everyone why we're there. And in some cases, I've literally had to say, I understand this is scary, but it's going to happen anyway, no matter what, if I talk about it or not talk about it. So we just need to move through it so we can get everything working for you the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Just reminding them that there's like, this is for the benefit, like what's in it for them.
Exactly.
I like that a lot. Pete likes it too. Pete's giving you rounds of applause. Anybody else out there? That was awesome. Thanks for chiming in, John. Had any of you have done these sessions where they kind of either go off the rails? Any other stories you want to share about how you've kind of structured these sessions in the past and kind of what you've seen? I would love to hear some color commentary if you'd like to share, especially about those directionless gripe sessions, because I think for me that's the biggest blocker why IT does not want to do these sessions. And that's something that I get met with a lot as a CSM. I'll be to customers, can I please meet these people? I want to interview them. And they'll say, no, they're just going to complain to you. You're not going to learn anything. But there are key moves that you can do to get back on track. So Jennifer, tell us what works for you. Have you gone through a session that turns into kind of like it takes a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride? What have you done? Tell us about your experience.
So for us, what I see a lot is, you've got the fractions, the people who are like, no, I'm going to just complain no matter what you tell me. I'm going to tell them I'm getting 10 pounds of chocolate and they're still not going to be happy. And then you get the people that are excited, and then you get the people that don't talk. But I think the two biggest things that I find that I struggle with a lot are the people that decide to go totally off topic. And they're like, well, yeah, you're talking about this, but I want to go complain about something totally unrelated. And that's always such a struggle, because it's like what you're saying is really valid, and I appreciate it, but how do I pull you back in? And it's redirection a lot of the times. And then the other struggle I think a lot is engaging those people that aren't talking, like they volunteer to be part of it and then they don't say anything. And I hate to call somebody out, hey, Mary, you haven't spoken at all. What do you think? So I'd say there's tricks about it, but those I think are some of the struggles that I find.
Thanks for sharing that. And I agree with you. And I have some thoughts on those two types of personalities, but I'd love to kick it to the crowd and kind of hear their insights. And I see a lot of people are raising their hands. I love that. Let's keep going. So I see next up, we've got Laura. So Laura, talk to us. What have you experienced with these kinds of sessions with different personalities, and how do you get it back on track?
Well, I'll say two things. One, when you've got your kind of technology deniers in the room, they could be salespeople or just technology deniers. It's easy to help turn them into your biggest champions by understanding those pain points that they do have. So just asking really great questions about the pain points they're bringing up, trying to redirect the gripe into the positive. What would it be like if you had a solution to that problem, to try to redirect their gripe into a positive? And then a previous organization did something very cool that I've never forgotten. If you're at your organization, you use DISC profiles or any other communication assessments, and who's in the room, they just level set by saying, we're going to have our quietest people speak first. So if you've done DISC profile, for example, you've got your S's and your C's, they're quiet, and your D's and your I's are loud, and they're more likely to share. And was it 16 voices or 50, whatever, 16, I think it's 16 voices or something, literally asking and saying, we're going to have our quietest people speak first, and that's going to be our kind of level set. It worked brilliantly. So, yeah.
That's cool. And I think by creating those rules of engagement, so to speak, at the beginning, it's like what you were saying you wanted to avoid, Jennifer, where you don't want to turn around and be like, we haven't heard from Pete in a while. There might be a reason. Maybe Pete doesn't feel great. But it kind of lets people, one, gives people a chance to speak, and two, it doesn't put the pressure on them for that sudden call out question during the middle of a conversation. Because also, another thing to consider is the politics. Who else is in the session with them? If I'm in the session with my manager, oh boy, that technology works for me. I know everything. I know where to find my answers. But then if you're with your peers, you might have a whole different type of conversation. So I see Mike's got his hands up. Mike, what's going on?
That's a really great idea to have the quiet people first. So thanks for that. We've done similar where like you said, rules of engagement. So define the why. Why are we here? What do we hope to get out of this engagement? And then defining some of the terms. So when you start talking governance and discovery, what does that mean? So there's some common ground there. And then been effective with, okay, everyone gets 2 to 3 minutes to speak their mind. And as a moderator, I'm going to cut you off at 3 minutes. And if we need to discuss more, we'll plan another meeting around that. And then what you alluded to earlier, what's the business need we're trying to solve here? So we can't, oh, it's Teams, oh, it's Yammer. Hey, we can throw a solution on top of a problem. No, let's define what the problem is first, and then what are your pain points, like you mentioned before, and your struggles. And then because we're in the Midwest, there's all that passive aggressiveness going on. So then you have the meeting after the meeting in the hallway. And so sometimes you want to be there with your little notepad to find out what people really think. So that's always been a challenge, and it drives the people on the East Coast who come to the Midwest absolutely bonkers when that happens. So
Yeah. I'm from New York, Mike.
Okay.
I totally get it. I was living in Chicago for a while, and it's a big difference. It definitely is. That was awesome. Thank you so much. I want to call out something that oh, Laura, did you put your hand back up? I want to make sure I'm giving you a chance to chime in.
No, sorry, I might have forgotten to put it down.
Oh, that's okay. Anything else you want to add while we have you?
No, this is awesome conversation.
Awesome. So I want to call out something that Jennifer said, because that's where I was going to go as a recommendation. Jennifer said, hey, if you have an in-person meeting versus like an online meeting, sometimes give people a chance to talk online. And that was part of my recommendation too. When I do a discovery session, and I actually have like a physical layout, what I like to do is I like to give people, maybe this comes from my experience being like an English teacher. I give people a few minutes. I'll give them a question, like you said, to kick off and to think about like what doesn't work for you, what's something that's a challenge. And I give them a few minutes just to jot something down. Typically, I try to structure my discovery sessions in teams because I'm trying to capture information. There's a lot going on. And sometimes as a facilitator, it's very difficult for me to whiteboard and answer questions and to kind of capture all of that. So I give people a chance to enter information either into a chat like we're doing now or into a channel. And I find that sometimes different personalities, like you said, you've got people that are outspoken that'll definitely tell you what's on their mind. And then you have people that might just kind of wait for that hallway conversation. So that might be a great way to use that chat and to get people involved, just to kind of, give them a different kind of platform and a different way to engage. These are awesome. These are really good pro tips, you guys. Thank you. Yeah, and that directionless Skype session, that is a big one. I'm sure that's going to come up again today. But yeah, so I just wanted to kind of set those boundaries, like what it is, it's listening. It's really listening to your end users. And what it's not a technical discussion. This is nothing to do with technology. This is more about workflows. What works for you? What are your challenges? Not about tech. The other thing I want to call out are the last two bullets I have, and these might be a little controversial. I like to think that in my discovery sessions, it's not the art of the possible. In Microsoft, we love the art of the possible. The art of the possible is fabulous. It's this world we live in that, where I have a magic wand and, all of the bells and whistles are turned on and everything works, right? But that's a demo, right? That's a way to help people catch the vision. It's a totally different kind of session. They're amazing, but this is not the platform. The other thing that's really challenging too is that this is not solutioning. You're going to listen to people share their feedback and share their insights, and your IT brain might be sitting going, oh, if they only used it, you could use Flows or you could use Viva. Have you heard of Viva Engage? This will solve everything. Or a company communicator. And it's so difficult to hold back because if they just knew that one thing, and if you could tell them that one thing, you'll save them hours of work. But hold back. We don't want to use it for that type of conversation because then it becomes a training and then it becomes IT, right? So might sound contradictory. You kind of don't want this to be an IT initiative. This is a people initiative. This is about listening and gathering that information. So yeah, I see people saying that too. Yeah, I have to remind myself not to solution. I do too. Sometimes I do these sessions with like a moderator and I'll have someone like Michelle's just call me out and be like, you're solutioning. I'm like, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Because you just want to solve people's problems. And that's why we're in the jobs we are, right? This is why we're in the roles we have. And this is why we do the work we do. So the other thing I want to call out too is discovery versus persona mapping. And this is just like a Dominique definition. For me, persona mapping is so important and I love it. And persona mapping, the way I understand it, is a lot more granular. It's a lot more role based. It's specific to how people in a particular role go through like their workflows and collaborate with their team. And I've been in persona mapping sessions. They're amazing, and they're all day sessions and all day workshops. And they have like this wonderful element of interaction with like post-its, and Microsoft hosts amazing persona workshops. If you're interested, reach out to me or Michelle or Pete. We could talk more about that. But to me, discovery is kind of like this middle ground, right? It's not necessarily the granular persona mapping workshop where you're going to spend a day or two. These are coffee talks, guys. These are sessions that are meant to be like a half an hour, maybe at most an hour, where you're just getting to know your end users, right? And you're kind of, in my mind, I think about these as conversations that are more workflow oriented or more kind of like business group oriented rather than role based, right? So kind of thinking about this as like, we'll go through different roles, but I mean, different units, but like HR, learning and dev, things like that. They're not necessarily like an operations manager or someone like at a specific role. That's how I like to define it. All right. I want to talk outcomes. Before I jump in there, any other questions or anything else that is top of mind, that there are light bulbs going off or stories that you'd like to share? Okay, I'm going to kick another question out there to the group. One of my biggest challenges at as a CSM, even driving change and adoption and trying to support that conversation, is actually getting the time with business groups to have these types of conversations. So I wanted to throw it out there. Why do you think that when you're doing change management, what are the barriers of entry that you've experienced? Or why do you think, change practitioners might skip the step, whether it is persona mapping or discovery? Why have you encountered as reasons why groups might overlook this, or they might just forego it altogether?
Operations, keeping the lights on always takes priority.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Time is money. I've been pitching these sessions to different organizations, and it's kind of, you get that feedback a lot. I see. Who is that? Laura is saying about understanding why it's important. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Not catching the vision. User availability. Yes, absolutely. Hey, my groups are busy. Sorry, they're moving, they're shaking, they're selling real estate. They can't talk to you. Oh, that's a big one. I like what Lisa's saying. Lisa is saying, thinking we know our people. Yes, Lisa, I'm going to call on you to talk more about that. But yeah, people being too busy, they don't want to pay for it. Yeah, it's hard to get people to make time. Yep, people are busy. Yep, absolutely. Cool. Let's talk about Lisa. If you feel comfortable to come off mute, tell us a little bit about your comment, because I could not agree more. Lisa says that people might skip this step because we think we know how people work and what they need.
Yeah, I think just as we look at the organization, right, we make assumptions
Mhm.
based on what we think people do in their jobs, how we think they interact with each other, what they might need technically, and then also how they consume information, right? So I think there's just a lot of assumptions in that space, and people say, we're not going to take the time. We already know, we think we know, right? Air quotes. And then that becomes a back burner to really understand.
Yeah, I totally get it. And I've seen that myself. I think with IT, we make data-driven decisions, right? That's the fun about being in technology and working with science. And I've seen groups look at licensing. Oh, they're consuming this, they're not consuming that. This is how they work. But I think that really kind of creates a challenge, because you can find yourself in a tricky spot where you think one thing and then you actually meet with the group and it's really different. Here's one of my favorite stories. And Michelle and Pete, if you guys have favorite stories you want to share like this, please let me know. But I recently did some discovery sessions, and if this customer is online, please feel free to come off mute and chime in too. But we met with their HR team, and their HR team had to create a vision for hybrid work, right? So I said, I want to understand a little bit more about what they think about hybrid work, and like what is their experience with it? Do they like it? You know, what's going on? And I met with them, and they hate hybrid work. They don't like it. It's clunky. They feel like they don't communicate. They feel like they're losing culture. They feel like people are disconnected. They're not onboarding the right way. They're not meeting candidates face to face. They feel like they're not attracting the right talent. And this was HR. This was the group that's setting the policy for remote work for the entire organization, and they don't think remote work works. So how's that for a finding? So that was one of those like eye-opening moments for me where we were like, okay, well, we have to focus on this group and show them that's when you could follow up with the art of the possible, right? Where you could follow up with training, you could follow up with white glove. Like there's so many different things that we could do for you at Microsoft. There's so many internal things that we could coach you to deliver for your organizations. But to me, that was one of the most shocking findings of like that disconnect where IT, was just like, oh, they have to work on hybrid work. They're coming up with the policy versus like their reality of, well, we don't like this. Hey, Michelle or Pete, have you ever kind of run into anything like that with your customers, where you found out that IT kind of really wasn't speaking the same language? I'm just curious, or anybody else on the call, you want to type in the chat or come off mute. I'd love to hear. These stories are always very interesting to me. I see Pete's coming online.
There's Pete. I was like,
any
I'm
stories
not
for
on,
us,
but go
Pete?
ahead, Pete.
I've run into less of the, oh, that doesn't matter, and more of the, oh, yeah, we know what we're doing. Everyone is exposed to that kind of scenario, and we know everything there is about a specific product or application. And then as you start to work with the groups, you realize that there's some general fundamentals that it might be missing. And that's always insightful too, because it changes the way that you talk about even some basic things, right? You got to kind of bring stuff back down to a different maturity level as you're guiding or as you're discussing just general topics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And even when you're talking about maturity level around like solutions or topics, another one that I've seen too is around training. Sometimes we'll meet with training and dev teams, and they'll still ask, what can we do to get our end users more engaged? What can we do to get people to go to trainings? And then you start talking to their business units and you find out, I use this analogy. I always say my calendar looks like Tetris because all the pieces, I have no free time sometimes. But then talking to the end users, they'll say the same thing, and they don't have, as we shifted to remote work, calendars became a lot more full, and then the free time that people had to attend trainings kind of went away, right? So then that's the core issue, right? It's not just that people don't want to learn or that they know it all and they're fine, but this is the kind of stuff that bubbles up, right? And this is the difference of the assumptions that, hey, people know it all, they don't come to trainings, versus we don't have the time to train, please help us protect our calendars or give us, time to engage. So that was another fun one. Yeah, I think that's so interesting, Pete. Anybody else find any interesting disconnects between IT assumptions and user outcomes?
Yeah, I can certainly go.
Yeah, Michelle, what's up? I want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty, right? There's plenty because I think generally there is a bit of a disconnect between the business and IT. I mean, that's just kind of commonly known. But what I find interesting is they may have a different opinion on if they feel like they're trained. And I think that's also interesting. I've had a customer where IT thought sending out those getting started guides just was enough and they didn't need anything more. And then talking to the business and I remember, I think it was like the marketing department and talking about some of the new things that were coming out in like Yammer. And they said, why didn't we know about this? And I'm like, okay, well, let's walk through what it is. And it's almost like because they didn't have an actual training department and IT was leading the training, that's kind of where the disconnect, because it's an old adage, IT departments roll out the product and think, okay, I'm done. I got to move on to the next thing. And there's never enough investment, I think, into that three-legged, I guess, what I call ACT. That's your adoption, your communication, and your training. And you need those three core pieces. A lot of times in companies, though, there's just no budget. And so IT may fold that under them. Maybe there might be one training person in IT, which is always really interesting to have training in IT. Because there's technical training, but there's people training, right? I think that's also that missing part. You can certainly train them all you want on the technical nature of how to formulate or use something, but you have to almost get to the why. And I don't know if you've experienced that too, Dom, but I'm certainly about the why. I'm in my personal life and of course in my professional life. And I know for every person on this call, they care about the why. What's in it for them? Why does it matter? What will it help them with? Will it shave an hour off their time? So I think that's my experiences.
I love it. Thank you, Michelle. That was awesome. Yeah, and I totally agree. I love that, like finding that why, finding out how this can save you time. And as we're looking at these key outcomes that I try to strive for with these sessions, that's kind of like the gist of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for scenarios. I'm out there to capture stories and use cases and scenarios and narratives. Like I said, I'm not thinking licensing. I'm not always thinking technology at this step. The next step down the road when we're solving problems for them. But right now we're capturing stories. We're making a case for change. Like Michelle said, why change? We're thinking back to that desire, right? That desire for change. Why is it important for me to change? Everything works well, the lights stay on. I don't need to take time to do something new. So this is the kind of seeds that you're planting. And that's what we were saying earlier. Like this change is happening whether you like it or not, but it goes a lot smoother when you get people on board, and then you could start to scale with evangelists and people that are influencers and people that are really excited and passionate about it. So that's why this desire stage and this discovery and understanding not only how your business works but what's important to them can really be so valuable. So I hope that helps. Okay, so I wanted to do like a little bit of kind of like some insight about how I try to map my findings. Like I said, I do try to map it to solutions. I'm not saying that I never talk technology. But when I think about the bigger picture, sometimes I try to think about mission, vision, culture, value, right? And I try to find those statements. These are Microsoft statements to kind of give you a kind of like a gist of what I'm looking for. Because I think if you could take those stories, like I shared another example from one of my customers, and if you're on the phone, please come off mute. I'd love to hear your insight too. But about building up ERGs that are exciting and energizing and engaging and get people excited to participate. And then we did discovery and we realized that the barrier to entry was just people were so busy, and like the hybrid work meant that they filled up their calendars. So what we did was we realized that one of their North Stars, very similar to Microsoft, was DNI. How can we map, this priority to engage in an ERG to their DNI initiative? So now what we were doing was a project that was technical. Like we could use some of the Viva tools, right? Solutioning. We could eventually use Viva tools. We can create communities. We could create teams. We could give people platforms to host meetings, right? So that's all stuff you can enable with the technology. But then to get that sponsorship, thinking about how to map it to that North Star. I know people say goals. I like to call it a North Star, but just like that their specific focus on DNI, right? So that's what I try to look for as I create that broader story around change for the organization, thinking about the mission and the vision. So for example, with Microsoft's mission to empower every person and every organization to achieve more. For me, giving people a chance to engage in hybrid work helps them do that because you can make your own adjustments. If you need to work from home, you could do it. If you want to work on site, you could do it. So it's kind of like how you take those findings and tell that story. So for me, this is some of those outcomes that I like to map to, and I like to use as a way to ground some of those findings and kind of prove out why we're doing it, right? So it's not just for like a Dominique change to be disruptive, or an IT project. This is supporting the business goals, right? And I think that's something that's pretty important too, is that yes, we're in IT. Yes, these are technical solutions that will solve the problems, but you're talking to people, right? And we're we're talking to business units, we're talking to groups that maybe aren't technical. And if we start mapping it to technical things like process or licensing or true ups or app rationalizations, things like that, they'll just glaze over, right? But if you're thinking of it, how can what you're doing here map to the broader goals of your organization? Sometimes that helps to drive that change too. Any thoughts? Any thoughts about that idea before we jump into who we can invite to these sessions? Talking a little bit about those outcomes, why we do them. Now we're going to talk about who gets it done. But before we get there, any questions or anything that you want to add, or any light bulbs going off, or experiences you want to share? And if you could think of things later, you could always put it in the chat. Okay, so let's jump ahead and let's talk about who is coming to your meetings. And I think this is the biggest question I get to, who do we invite? Who's coming to the meetings? These are my 4 go-to categories. Yours might be different, and I want to hear what those are, because I might just be missing something, or the way that I like to find my stories might be a little bit different. But I like to start with human resources. I love to talk to learning and dev. I love to talk to communications, and I love talking to operations. So here's why my Dominique logic as to why I choose those 4. These are core business functions. And these are business units that will interact with almost everybody in the business at every level, right? You're going to hear from communications, you're going to get training from learning and dev, and most of us have our experience, with the company. Our first point of entry is HR, right? So it's really important to tap into those groups, because when you think about the broader picture of what you're accomplishing with discovery and with those learnings, they have the most insight too, right? Because they're going to be working with so many other groups that they could help you eventually, as you're thinking of like, who else should I talk to? So you could see I put little taglines under each of these groups. They don't necessarily correspond to the business unit, but when you're thinking about who to invite, like who are the best business units to invite to these sessions, you could also expand it, maybe not necessarily on business unit, but you could think about specific people. Who's a decision maker? Who's an evangelist? Who's that person that is just like a tech whiz that will always say, "Oh wait, did you hear about this feature? Like this is so cool. If you do it this way, this will be so much better." Someone that's an influencer, right? Someone that either from the top down will say, "From now on, we're using Teams," and people use Teams, or somebody who just has like that kind of innovative spirit that people look to for change. And then obviously champions, people that will help you spread your message, people that will be a positive representation of your message, like, hey, you can do it. And this is what we were talking about a little earlier. Sometimes those people that are the squeaky wheels or the grouchy ladybugs, sometimes they could be your biggest advocates. Because it's like kind of like that old commercial, like Mikey likes it. I think where Mikey's eating cereal and it's like, wow, this kid really likes cereal. And he normally doesn't like anything. Sometimes turning around someone that is like a grouch, or someone that's reluctant to change, and then seeing them become like not only an advocate, but just really successful by the project, can really help you highlight the work that you're doing. It's difficult. It's not easy, but it could be pretty beneficial. So that's kind of like how I think about the roles that I invite, roles that touch the entire org, people, the decision makers, change agents, evangelists, champions, influencers. That's kind of like how I start. So I'd love to hear. This is the question I'd love to kick out to the audience, because especially if you've done these sessions, who do you invite? What kind of considerations do you take when you make these invitations? And then who else should we be speaking to? These are my 4 go-tos, but you don't have to be the only ones. So where did you find success, or where did you find blockers? Where did you run into stumbling blocks? And I'll stop talking for a little bit, so I'll give people a chance to think and to respond. Okay, Mike, let's hear from you. So Mike, how have you recruited people to come to your sessions?
It provide the carrot. Hey, we want to try and make your life easier, so let's have a chat. The flip side of that is, in highly regulated industries, there's less freedom. So finance, healthcare. So curious what your experience is with some of that when you get into the floor on the patient wards and nurses and downtime procedures and know, in the finance companies where you're fairly structured?
That's a great question. I've done discovery with healthcare, and it those sessions were more siloed. I worked with like the healthcare administrators, so I really wasn't working with people on the floor. So it might not be those protected roles that you were thinking of, especially not finance, where there are clear boundaries of who could talk to who. But I worked with them, and then sometimes with those types of with the follow-up conversations, I was working kind of like more one-on-one and just talking to people one-on-one instead of a larger group. But I think that's going to be very different, like you said, with finance. And then I was in the hospital administration. So it's probably different once you get onto like those other levels. Anybody else have any experience with those like more regulated industries? I'm thinking like finance, healthcare. How do you approach those conversations where they might be a little bit more protected with regulations?
I found that with finance in particular, that a lot of the people are used to working together. So if anything, you don't have to do as much discovery on who to invite to the table, because if you ask legal, they're like, oh, we're going to get risk, we're going to get compliance, and we're going to have, and they already have who is the appropriate content or contact to be there, kind of at the ready. So that's been really nice, at least from like an operational structure.
And I think that's a super good point, Pete. Like you want to avoid when I do these sessions, they're more like business unit focused, or like you said, specific people that are hand chosen. Do not invite people that clash. Like you were saying, you don't want to have it be like an actual fight. I've been in conversations where it seems like they're going more towards conversations about like it becomes technical, especially when it becomes technical. It becomes like very tense. The other thing I would say to avoid too is avoid hierarchies if you can. You know, don't like I said, if you invite my manager, oh boy, everything is going just fine. But you want to think about, you know, the people that are in your session in terms of like the levels as well. You don't want to have your director of necessarily, because people may not be too be very candid with their responses. Yeah, I like what I'm seeing here too. So looking for specific individuals, right? So when you're recruiting people to put sessions together, or you're inviting specific individuals, people that are trainers, people that are kind of like they serve as that like go-to person, and they could be an excellent representative. I totally agree. Like outside of IT, obviously, but people that have that eyes and ears of the department. Yeah, Michelle, what works for you?
So let me grab my camera, do all the buttons. I worked as an architect, an M365 architect in the financial industry, and I think what's really important too, and is knowing what you have configured. So if you're in a regulated industry, you have to adhere to certain compliances before you start bringing in trainers like Microsoft Store trainers or Microsoft CSMs or some other partner. You have to make sure that you at least do some sort of comparison before you throw some demo environment together to go, okay, how do you have it configured here? Let's make the same, and then go from there and doing that training. Because if they see something that they really like, guess what? They're going to be really loud and say, I want that, like private channels, but maybe you're in GCC, right? Things like that throughout the transition of the products that we deliver. You've got to know, I guess, at your organization, what is turned on and turned off and why. So I know that's probably a technical thing, but I think it's important because then you start miscommunicating and people are like, why don't I have that? Because I would love that. Or I saw this over here, which we do publicly, right? When we announce things, they're like, oh, I can't wait. And then they never get it. So, it's understanding the regulatory requirements. And I think some of those industries may not even do a good job at communicating why do they have some things shut off, for instance. So that's important.
No, that's super important, especially for a role at Microsoft and like as CSMs, like you said, because you never want to come in as a CSM, because we are not sales. I'm not there to land a sale. I'm not there to try to get you to use different products necessarily. I'm trying to get you to use the ones you own differently. but you never want to be in a position to where you don't know those restrictions. And you start talking to a customer and you're like, hey, have you guys ever heard of private channels? Like that could do so much. And then you lose trust, right? People, your, sponsors and people that helped you meet these business units might lose trust in you because they think you're doing like an upsell, right? Or they think you're over promising, and now they're in a position where they have to tell their end users no, right? No, you can't do that, and then it becomes kind of sticky. So yeah, I think even though you're not talking technical, it's still really good to go into these sessions knowing what they can and can't do, because even though, like you said, Michelle, not necessarily solutioning, I'm listening, and I'm listening to these stories, and as I'm hearing this feedback, I'm in my head, I'm thinking, okay, they'll need this, they'll need that, they'll need that. And it helps me kind of also guide that conversation as well. Cool. So the next part I'm going to talk about, like, how do you get that information out of end users and what kind of questions you can ask. But before I do, anybody else have any insights into the audience, any pro tips, or any kind of rakes that you stepped on that you got hit with? And if you could think of any later, you could always put it in the chat. We have a pretty lively chat going. I love it. Okay, let's talk about questions. What type of questions should you ask? Like I said, these are more conversational. These more like an interview type of style. So we have like this. I have this concept of like the good, better, best questions, right? So good questions get responses, and they generate question. Better questions generate questions, and then the best type of questions will generate discussions. Like hopefully what we're trying to do here, right? Get people talking to each other, because even though you're facilitating the session, you don't want to necessarily make it an interrogation. Like it's an interview, but it's not an interrogation where you're going to say like, what's your challenge? What's your weakness? Where do you need help? What's your workflow? That's not fun. He wants to go through that. But you want to have hopefully inspire conversation, right? So asking those open-ended questions that generate the discussion will help you kind of as a facilitator take a seat, step back, and let that conversation go. So you could take notes and you could really listen, right? And I think there's definitely an art to it as you're coming up with questions. One of my pro tips is to kind of plan a few questions ahead of time. I'll show you what I've used in the past just to get conversations going. And I'd also love to hear what you use to get conversations going. But just think in terms of like open-ended questions, right? Don't think of questions like yes or no. Like, is this hard for you? Yeah. Is this easy? Yeah. Doesn't go anywhere. So here's some examples like fact finding. What means do you have to stay in touch with your organization? How do you find information quickly? You can see that they're not that. I would say we're going to talk productivity. We're not going to talk product. So this is not product specific, even though in my head or your head, you might be mapping it back to something. We're talking to the business. We're having end user conversations. We're just kind of leaving that product out of it. Asking people to connect the dots or call it to action. And this is where like having cameras on becomes really helpful. The idea of calling to action, or especially if you're in person, and I know that's a luxury we really don't all have right now. But asking people to go cameras on is really helpful because you could see those head nods and you could see the body language and you could call on people and say, hey, I see you really nodding your head, or I see you smiling, or I see you kind of feel like you're not on board with that. That's a great way to get that conversation going. Pick up on those verbal and nonverbal cues, and that will help people get engaged, like you said, at all different levels, whether they're shy or outspoken. But it just gives you a chance to see kind of like how people are responding. So with that being said, for those of you who have led these conversations, what type of questions do you ask? What's a question that you feel like really gets people opening up to you and it really helps you start to kick off that conversation? To hear the tools that you use too. If you could think of it later, you can put that in the chat as well. Yeah, if you could think of any questions that you use to help end users or help kind of do this discovery, do this persona mapping. Ooh, Barbara Smith. What does collaboration look like for you now? How you find information quickly. Right on. Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. Because you're talking about collaboration, you're talking about workflows. And I think a question like that, Barbara, gets people into saying, like, it doesn't work for me. Like, or it's clunky, like that HR experience I had. What methods of communication and collaboration are typically better? Yeah, that's a good one too. How are people communicating? How are people collaborating? Pain points. Yep. What are your what doesn't work with communication? Priorities. Yes, Laura, that's awesome. I like that too, because that's like elevating the conversation a lot too. Like, what are your priorities? What's important to you? And that goes back to what I said about the North Star, like mapping back those priorities. Like, oh, hey, I know that efficiency is important to you. I know that, cross-functional collaboration is important to you. What does that look like? So starting with those priorities is a really great way to engage as well. That's really awesome. Yeah, that's good. Good questions are difficult, I think. Like I said, it's a little bit of an art. And it's a great pro tip also to capture these questions down, to kind of see what resonates with your conversations, where people really light up. I always like to, like I said, to add a little bit of sunshine and talk about like what works well, because that helps you amplify it. And sometimes during these conversations, you could see who's speaking up more, and you can kind of get a sense of, oh, this is something that is really, this person's really passionate about. Because I what I've noticed too in each organization is that there is somebody that wants to do this process better, that has a better way to do it, but it's not their role, right? It's not their role. It's totally outside of their rank to say, like, guys, if only we use like, Teams for meeting notes, we could save so much time instead of sending it back and forth, sending agendas, and email. But it's not up to them to say it. So this kind of gives them a forum to say those things, and it helps you as a change practitioner to articulate that for them. Ooh, how do you define success? I like that. What's your workflows? How do you define success in those workflows? It's nice. And I think that too. We can't assume as facilitators we get what they do, and that's a challenge also, right? Like it goes back to don't make assumptions. But sometimes you'll hear about these funky processes, and just ask them about those processes, because you don't want to necessarily assume that you know why they're doing it, because there might be some reason as to what's happening behind the scenes. Here's some of my questions, and they're pretty like pithy. Nothing nothing is gonna make you like go wow. But just like typical workday, where do you work? What kind of activities do you use? What kind of devices do you use? It just kind of helps me understand how they're plugging in. I would definitely take off apps for this, but just understanding like, what does a workday look like? What priorities are important to you as a business unit, like you were saying? How does your team collaborate, communicate? What does cross-functional collaboration look like? And is there a routine process daily, weekly with too many steps, like that you just spend too much time doing? So those are some of the questions that I ask. And because you are in this world and modern work, you kind of see where I'm going with it. Even though I'm talking workflows and I'm talking productivity, you could see me mapping it, I'm sure, or you're mapping it too. Like, oh, she's thinking about automation, or she's thinking about apps, or she's thinking about, different types of mobility tools. Yes, I am. Okay, so what tools do you have in your toolbox? So how does this happen for you? Good, better, best scenarios. And I'd love to hear how you've done your sessions, how you've structured them, and especially how you structure them in this hybrid world, because like I said, on-site is not always an option for everybody right now. So the tools in your toolbox, what I've seen work for organizations, using a survey to capture sentiment, that's good, especially considering like the speed of your project. If it's a project with a really crunched deadline, or you have to reach a really wide audience, sometimes asking these questions in a survey is good, or it's at least a good first step to see like who's gonna actually get back to you, and what are some of the things they're saying. So that's kind of like a good, quick, broad brush to paint with. Better, and I think this is what we were talking about earlier with the regulated industries, is scaling feedback with large meetings. When it comes to regulated industries, you would not want to do this, but sometimes you want to tap into. I think someone was saying, you could find champions, or you could find people based on who's worked in projects in the past. So you could kind of work with your champions group and have like a big, broad type of conversation. And then for me, my go-to, my ideal size of a group is like 8, like 5 to 8, small focus groups. And that kind of helps me get around the different communication styles in a lot of ways, because I think if people are, maybe, I don't want to say like they're quiet, like, but maybe more listeners than they are actively speaking, it gives people a chance to chime in. I liked speaking up in smaller groups, even though I'm doing a big presentation right now. But if I was in a big presentation, I would definitely hang back a lot more. So I think for me, the sweet spot is like small, focused conversations. And those are the tools that I've seen used. Anybody else? What do you use? How have you done your persona mapping? I think is a whole other world where it's a workshop and it's interactive, and you're using post-its and you're really engaging and answering questions and filling out surveys together. It's cool. But what about other tools? What have you used to find out how people work?
I have an example, Mike again.
Yeah, Mike, let's hear it.
A day in the unit.
Oh,
So
yeah, cool.
pick up, and even on the technical side, sometimes that can be useful. So I'm not a BA, I'm not a project manager, but I run some of the back end systems or 365. Let's go spend half a day with HR, or half a day with finance, or half a day on the floor with a nurse or something, or a stockbroker. And a lot of times the eyes get really big for a lot of the ISIT folks. And it's like, I had no
That's
idea.
awesome. Mike, I can't believe I left it out. You're spot on. I actually, a colleague of mine did some job shadowing at a plant recently, in like a manufacturing plant, and she was trying to find out like processes to automate. And that's and she learned, like you said, the eyes get wide. She learned that part of the reason why they have like product slowdowns is because they physically have to walk from one side of the plant to the other to look for specific components to use. And that's something you can only really gain insight to when you're on site, when you actually see how people are working. And I love the examples you shared too, like working in a hospital, especially. Hey, Laura, what about you? Like, let's hear what you have to say.
Well, of course, with our Teams implementation, we're using champions. So that's, an important group to keep continuous feedback going. But I was on a large ERP project at an enterprise level organization. And in addition to all of these tools, so I think part of the important thing for a bigger organization is to make sure you use a variety. They also used very targeted long-term, or by long-term, about 2 week long sessions with business process analysis with each business unit. Yeah, where they would identify, the key processes that really needed to be dove into. But the point was to find out what those aha moments were, where the department really didn't even know what was really going on in their own processes, because they had hybrid employees, because they had 5 products they were using. And in order to get an efficient process mapped out and then make it even more efficient before they put it into the software, that's the only time I've ever seen an implementation prioritize that before implementation. And it was really amazing. So I just thought that was really cool.
That is amazing. That's like a very big investment in time. I love it. And did you feel like after they did that, those findings helped set the project up for success? Or or set it up for success differently than other projects
For
in the past?
sure. And they empowered employees. They brought in a consultant who trained a group of employees as
Oh,
business process
cool.
analysts. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And of course, then as members of the project team, we all got to know those business units very well. And then we became their shepherd for the rest of the project. It was really cool.
Cool. That is a
Mhm.
gold standard. That's awesome. I love that.
Yes, it was cool.
That is amazing. I haven't heard of anything at such depth. Have you, Pete? I think is really interesting.
No, I haven't. That sounds amazing.
Right? That is great. I love it. And I love the ability to scale too, Laura. Like I love the idea of scaling with partners or different dedicated resources, because sometimes, especially being in an IT role, you become like the chef, cook, and bottle washer in a lot of ways. So having people that are either specialists or people that can help you scale to find these learnings is so critical. and keep it coming. Keep sharing this feedback in the chat. I love to hear these stories. And building off of what Laura and Mike were saying, I also put a question in there too about keeping the conversation going. You kind of want to set the tone too, that this is not just like a one and done type of conversation, but you want to keep an ear out. Like you said, maybe not necessarily because you're recruiting these groups as champions, because sometimes they don't have the bandwidth to be a champion, and that's okay. But how can they keep sharing with you? How can they keep sharing this feedback? And hopefully over the course of the conversation, you establish that you're listening to them. You're really listening, and you're going to help solve their problems. So you want to make sure you're still there for them. Okay, and finally, we were talking about the stick and carrot, or just the carrot. That's what I like to think of. What's in it for me? And this is kind of like what Michelle was talking about on like a broader level, but thinking about rewarding people for their time. People are busy right now, and calendars are packed. Every customer I talk to, that's like the number one problem, is people like finding time to get their job done because they're in back-to-back meetings. So if you can get people to give you a half an hour of their time, an hour of their time, you could design something really fun, like just a fun incentive. Gamification goes a long way. Maybe giving people prizes, a raffle. And then also building towards training. I like to take my discovery sessions, and I'll talk about the outcomes a little bit later, but for people that participate, I'll try to like customize a specific training plan for that specific group, to help them understand, like to help them solve their problems, or to team them up with people like Michelle that were in like MTC architects. It's like, okay, I learned this, like let's solve your problems. And then rewards and prizes. So my sessions, I'll go through a quick overview in the next few minutes of what I've done. I like calling these coffee talk sessions. I used to give people like coffee gift cards. I think it's fun. I can't give them coffee in the office. So we do like a virtual coffee. I'll give them either like a sugar wish, and it's sponsored by Microsoft, or like a virtual gift card that they could buy their own coffee together. But just as a way to say thank you for your time, because people are busy, and it's really outside of their role and outside of their day to day to participate in these types of conversations with you. So it's just a nice incentive, and I'd love to hear what you've done in the past to reward people, or to give them kind of gamification. That's a whole other conversation. Gamification is so fun. There's so much we could say there, but just thinking about ways that you could reward people. Mine was coffee. I can be bribed by coffee. So yeah, when I kick off my sessions, I always set the boundaries. Hey, this is 30 minutes. We're just going to chit chat. I want to explore a day in your life, understand the way you work. I want this to be interactive. And I just try to set that tone. Like you said, the rules of engagement. I want this to be fun. I want this to be engaging. I don't want this to be like the Dominique show. I want people to ask questions and answer questions. And then my best scenario is it gives me a chance to step back and have them go and kind of have a discussion amongst themselves, and I'll take notes. I also clarify what it's not. So it's not a demo, it's not a training, it's not a solution, it's not a hackathon. So I just make sure that they're very clear on like what we're doing, how we're doing it, and then the goals. So the goals, I'm listening to you. Why am I here? I want to help you come up with a training plan to upskill. I want to capture your stories and scenarios, and I want to help you eventually innovate your process. Okay, so for me, the outcome, I have a few outcomes. Like what do I do as a next step? Here's my template. This is just like gibberish that I use as a placeholder. But what I try to do is to kind of create a little story about the day in the life, to capture some of those core workflows, and then to propose solutions, right? Like what are we solving for you? What are we going to do as a next step? So after I do the discovery sessions, typically I'll follow up with the project owner, and I'll pitch this to them and say, hey, look, here's some of their workflows. Here's some of the tools that you already own from Microsoft, and here's how they could leverage them to solve their problems, right? And here's how we can make that happen. So I will rely on the project owner to coordinate those follow-ups, and either we'll pitch it back to them, or they'll use that information to train that particular group. And that's where like those really awesome, I'm gonna toot our own horn a little bit, but that's where our tools can become really useful, because if it's a technical solution, I could route them to the Microsoft Technology Center. If it is something like a training, we have a training team standing by that we could plug them into. or if it's just coaching and productivity, I could do that myself. But we try to think about ways that we could solve, but not in necessarily do the feature hit parade. I'll never sit there and go, here's the top 10 features that'll solve your problems. I want to talk about this in the context of their workflows. I want to talk about this in the context of the scenarios and the use cases. And that's going to help me drive adoption, right? That's going to help me really land that vision. When it comes to scale, that's where this process becomes a little challenging, because if you remember, I said, okay, cool, you're going to meet with a few key groups. You're not meeting with everybody. But if I meet with those 4 groups, you know, and I'm proposing custom training plans, I'm really proposing 4 custom training plans. There's a few ways that you can go from there. If I meet with someone in HR, I could ask for follow-up, like recommendations, depending on how long you want to spend doing discovery. Like, do you have any other groups that I should talk to? Anybody else on your team that I should meet? You could always follow up there, or you could scale it. Sometimes you'll notice common themes. For example, when I did discovery recently, I learned the challenges around that this organization had around hybrid work. I learned about, you know, hey guys, we really want to learn, we just don't have time to learn. So there will be common themes that you could use, and that'll help you kind of structure not only your change plan, but your training plan as well. So I hope this helped. Michelle, I know I'm wrapping a few minutes early, but I would love to kind of turn the floor over to everyone on the call and give you a chance to share some of your insights, share some of your best practices around discovery. And like I said, it might just be a term that I'm using that you might call something slightly different, but it's really just a way to have a conversation with your end users, really understand how they work, and as an outcome, think about ways that you could solve with technology or scale based on the scenarios that you've captured. So I'd love to hear some thoughts. Michelle, thanks for coming off mute. What do you think? Have you done this before with
Sure.
customers?
Sorry, I was running around. I was trying to get my cats out of the room. So yeah, you know, I would say that what I found to be pretty successful were surveys. One example that I'll share, and I think this was pretty relevant, probably 5 years ago, 6 years, 7, I don't even know, can't tell time during, you know, the pandemic. So a while ago, when I had rolled out O365 at an organization, I mean, just a complete shift to go from on-prem to cloud, I set up this entire like phased approach of how we were deploying. And I actually had 14 touch points. So I have like a case study out somewhere on the interwebs, but 14 touch points to make sure that people felt informed, to make sure they knew where training was, that they were communicated to, that one of those touch points or 2 of them included the leaders. So I worked with the admins to make sure the leaders were the ones who were pushing the communication, even if I templated it. It's knowing that, okay, leaders also want this, want people to change, want people to feel connected to the organization and what they're trying to adopt. So think of through, I think there was a before survey and an end survey. So after deployment, capturing those. So there are a variety of different ways I think you can do some of the early discovery or some of the how to get people prepared for a change. But I don't think that people do it enough. You know, when they're going to roll something out that's new, you've got to have this kind of end to end, think through the variety of ways people want to be communicated, the variety of things that they may need. And the end result, we ended up using, and I always recommend this, so I've done this in 2 companies, having a location where people can share feedback. So if they have questions or they still didn't understand, or maybe they didn't read the email, because let's be real, that's if it's anything below the fold, guess what? They're probably not going to read it. So keep it short, keep it sweet. But we ended up using Yammer Communities as that central location for a forum so people could feel more comfortable. And the champions that we had created along the way, naturally, in the end, were the ones answering all those questions. So everyone could just sit back and relax and let kind of that organically happen and, you know, let them run the show. So lots of learnings I think I've had over the years, but I'd say that one in particular, just being that we thought about it so carefully and we cared so much about end users and how employees were going to feel about a change, did it in a way that really thought about how it's moving their cheese, just like you said in the beginning. Like it's true. If you move somebody's cheese, I mean, my God, that could affect their productivity. So doing it in a way that hopefully improves it in the end. And those are some of the things that I've certainly learned.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that you're saying, Michelle, because I've run into that too. And I love the idea of using surveys. I saw Laura had her hands up also. Laura, I know you put your hand down, but if you're still here, I'd love to you to expand as well, because you said that you were using teams and channels to dedicate to the conversation to gather learning and feedback. And it sounds like you kind of had a similar experience around that.
We did, yes. We chose not to adopt Yammer in our organization yet. We're just focused on Teams. And so even something as relatively simple as rolling out our mobile apps to our users, we created a team just for that pilot. And we're using that same model now to deploy collaboration teams within our organization. And so, we created a feedback channel within a team. And within that, yes, we posted surveys, but we also created a drip of informal feedback questions. So every other day, a question that we would want to know kind of how things were going. And we saw people respond, or I saw people respond that maybe weren't the normal people that engaged in conversation. And that was really fun to see over time. And then we did supplement that with tournament of teams and gamified it, which certain users get really excited about and others maybe don't. But it was our first time trying to pull all of that into one experience because we wanted to test it out before rolling out teams. And it really did work very well. And it was really easy to do. So kudos to Microsoft for making that. It's not without its bumps, but it really was relatively painless for us to accomplish that. And we're excited to use a similar format for our collaboration and Teams rollout now. So
yeah, that sounds super interesting. I think you should do a panel next time, Laura. I love gamification, and I love hearing different strategies on gamification and success stories, because it really is so different for each org and each culture. But it's really cool to hear what people come up with. So thanks for sharing that. And I love what you're sharing too, like how it becomes organic and how you could see people starting to raise their hand. And to me, something I want to call out, that's the danger I think that we run into sometimes as IT, where you have like your go-to champions and they're just champions for everything. They're champions for Excel and OneDrive and like PowerPoint. Like you'll find that if you start tuning into the community and give it the chance for the community to express their voice, people are starting to care about different things differently, right? And you'll have people that are huge advocates for workflows and people that are huge advocates for Power BI. But they're not going to be the same person. And if you try to have the same group, I think it starts to fatigue them. Do you think so too, Michelle? Or that's what I
totally.
find?
Yeah. What was interesting. So in the deployment process, the pre, the during, the after, having a Yammer community, what naturally happened is it got way too loud, way too noisy. And so people were like, hey, what's this cool thing called Power Automate? So then they ended up creating all these different communities that were more product centric that I thought were pretty interesting because it just organically happened, right? They wanted to have a subset because they cared more about this. And just allowing them to do that and encouraging them to say, hey, create your own community where you can, connect to others who care about this product or they're using it in a cool way to share, your story.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, not to talk solutions, but I've seen a customer of mine create a champions super user group around platform, and it's awesome. And she hosts this monthly series where they get to share a flow that they built or share an app that they built, and they vote on it, and they get to choose like who won and who built the best app that week. And I've also seen a super user community around Power BI where like who has the best data visualization. But for example, if you bring someone like me into like like personally into like a data visualization, I'm going to glaze over. Like, I don't work well with data that way, but maybe Michelle, maybe you'll light up and you'll be the greatest advocate. But if you brought
Right.
someone like me into teams, I love teams. I love talking about communication and collaboration and how people work together. So it really gives you a good chance to find the right people to be your right advocates.
Right. And I wanted to share, and I don't know if everyone on the call is aware, but we do have a couple links, and I'm desperately searching for them, but they're day in the life guides that we've pre-built, and they're really cool and they really are helpful. So we've got role guides. They're all on adoption.microsoft.com. So there's view resources by role, so you can learn kind of what a day in the life from those roles are. And they help you if you're building personas. They help you focus in. Hey, perfect. Within adoption.microsoft.com, you do have those guides that help for if you are working on, maybe you've got compliance or you have construction or whatever industry that you might be in. You've got a way that you can learn about what the day in the life could look like. And then from there, verify what, if that's really true for your own organization. And then take a look at things that might help enable some of the applications or different touch points in there that could be more applicable and to help them save time.
I think you're spot on, Michelle. And I think this could also help you save time too, to kind of give you that core base understanding to start to move away from your assumptions or even start to structure questions, based on what you learn here. We haven't done it for all roles, but it definitely is a good start. So guys, I know we have like 10 more minutes left in our session. Please stick around if you want to ask any questions or if you want to just chit chat with us. But if not, you want 10 more minutes just to stand up and stretch and shake it out.
Yeah,
totally
we are.
get it.
This is the end. This is the last session. So I'm going to go ahead and put
Tough
those
spot,
links in
guys.
here.
Thanks for hanging in there with us. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the last session
Jeez.
of the day. Hopefully everybody enjoyed themselves. Please fill out your survey events. But before we go, I don't want to end your session early. If anyone has anything else that they want to share, please come off mute or throw it in the chat.
Guys, thanks so much.
Yeah, well, let's all give Dominique a round of applause. I think that was a really great discussion and great presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, please fill out your survey again. Finish that up. You will be entered to win a Surface Go laptop. We're really excited to be able to, from our sponsors, get that kind of money, be able to give $25 on every single session. So I want to go ahead. I usually put, and thanks, Dominique. I usually put all the names of everybody kind of participating into a wheel of wow. I know they use that in several other conferences. So the lucky winner, let me just spin it. And thanks for hanging in too. I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday. Mike Breck, you are the lucky winner. So I'll find your, first off, congratulations. $25, I believe, Amazon gift card. But thanks everyone for just participating and staying on and giving such great, discussion and feedback in this session. But Mike, I'll find your email address in our registration and look for the gift card within the next few days. So with that,
Mikey, he likes it. Thank you.
Everyone else, have a wonderful holiday break, and thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed all the workshops, sessions we've had today. We'll be back on December 12th, the second Monday of the month from 12 to 3 p.m. per our usual cycle. It's every single month, and we're going to have an Ignite panel of experts. So come and check it out. Some great MVPs sharing what they learned at Ignite and how they're applying it into their own organizations. So everyone, thank you so much and enjoy the weekend. Thank you.